Today I'm just going to take off and talk to you about how my mind works and how some of these videos come about and what happens during some of them. And all these things are related to one another. Start with the word sojourner. Over there on that wall there's a sign that says Sojourner's Retreat, and that's what I named this room. It's called lots of other things. There's signs in here that say man cave, things like that, but the official name of this place is Sojourner's Retreat. I think there's even a sign back there above the refrigerator that says Moon's Room, but this is the Sojourner's Retreat. And the word sojourner is a word that I like. I just like saying it. I like the way it sounds. I like the thoughts that it provokes in my mind. Probably the first place I ever saw it was in the Bible. The word appears in the Bible several times, and it refers to nomadic people. I think the official meaning of the word, in its simplest form, simplest meaning, is one who doesn't stay in one place too long or very long. And you might think that a synonym would be wanderer, people that wander around, but I think there's a small distinction between, at least in my mind there is a distinction between sojourner and wanderer. And the wanderer doesn't stay in the same place too long either, but I think wandering has a connotation to it which is more random than sojourner. I think a wanderer is someone who goes from place to place with no particular design or no particular reason. It's more or less haphazard or random. Moving around, and a sojourner moves around with more purpose than a wanderer. Something prompts the sojourner to move, and the sojourners in the Bible moved because the place they were in became overgrazed and they needed to move so that their flocks of animals could have something to eat. So they went to one place and they stayed there for a period of time, and when the food source for the animals began to be depleted, they moved to another place. And they were referred to as sojourners. My mind sojourns. In other words, I won't say I have trouble staying focused, but I could say that. When I'm thinking, or often when I'm having a conversation even, my mind goes many places and it doesn't always get back to where it started. And we might be having a conversation and what you're saying prompts my mind to go somewhere, and before it's my turn to speak again, my mind has went here and here and here because of something that you said to me or something that was brought up in a conversation or a discussion. And you can see that happen sometimes. When I'm having a video, making a video, and I'm going along about something, and suddenly something occurs to me, and I go there and talk about that, and then that prompts something else, and I go there and I talk about that, and sometimes I don't get back to where I was when my mind began to sojourn. And this happens most elaborately and most often and most out of my control and most actually troubling to me in the middle of the night when there's nothing. There's no outside influence. There's no someone else interjecting thoughts or me having to carry on a conversation or stay focused on. A thought occurs to me when I'm awake in the middle of the night and it's quiet and no one else is involved, and that thought, I began thinking about what prompted that thought, and then it leads to something else or someone else, and then that leads to something else. And now I may start here and be trying to maintain specifically this, and I may end up here or here or here or over there, and do that by going a multitude of places as my mind sojourns. One example might be, have you ever played the Kevin Bacon game? A few years ago, that used to be a popular game to play, and some of you may have heard of it and understand what I'm talking about. Others that have no clue. In fact, some of you are young enough to say, you know, I don't even know who Kevin Bacon is. Well, he's an actor, been in lots of movies. One that you might remember him in is A Few Good Men. He was the prosecutor who was prosecuting the case for the government against the two young Marines, and Tom Cruise was defending them, and Kevin Bacon was representing the Marines in the United States government, and JAG, or whoever that is that Marine lawyers are. It was Kevin Bacon. But the game is, some actor's name is mentioned, and you have to tie that name, whoever it is, to Kevin Bacon. For instance, one I just mentioned was Tom Cruise. Someone says Tom Cruise. That would be an easy one to do. You could say Tom Cruise, A Few Good Men, Kevin Bacon. They were in the same movie. A lot of times you have to go from one to another to another to another to get those two tied together. In other words, you have to mention a movie, then mention another movie that some other actor was in, and then mention the movie that actor was in, another movie that a different actor was in, and you might go through 4 actors to get to a place where that actor that you finally got to by going from movie to movie to movie was in a movie with Kevin Bacon, and that's how the Kevin Bacon game's played. And that's kind of how my mind works. It goes from one seemingly random thought to another sometimes, but it's not random, it's all connected in one way or another. And an episode just like that prompted this video. I've been thinking about doing a video about auctions. Not auctions, but auctioneers. A general video about auctioneers and some of the thoughts I have about auctioneers and how they work and how they differ and how many of them are the same. And in making that video, I decided to make it general about auctions and auctioneers, but also make it specific in having the main theme of it being a discussion of the Robinson Auction Company. Or I don't know that that's the exact name of it, but the company that began in the middle 1970s was begun by an auctioneer, a young man named Roger Robinson. That's what I was thinking about when my mind took this sojourn that I'm going to describe to you. I was thinking about that auction. I'm still going to make that video. I want you to keep in mind that I'm making that, and I'm still gathering material for it and collecting thoughts and developing an outline in my mind. But I got off on a sojourn while I was doing that, and it's caused me to have to make this video in the meantime. I was thinking about Roger Robinson and his early beginnings, and in my mind, you cannot think about Roger and his early beginnings as an auctioneer without thinking about his mother, because his mother was part of his team in the early days. More often than not, when they had an auction, she was the cashier. She was the lady that you stepped up to before the auction started and got your bidder's card. she took your information, gave you your bidder's card, and then at the end of the day, she took your money when you went to pay for the things that you'd bought. Roger Robinson's mother. To me, Mrs. Robinson. That's what I would have called her. Now, I knew her name, her first name in those days, and it's really bugging me that I can't think of it, what it was. And I'm going to have to ask Roger or Stephen or somebody what Roger's mother's name was. But it's prompted this video because it caused me to start thinking about women of that relative age to me. Probably not just women but men, but I didn't think about men, I just thought about women, and my mind it took off. And it began to go places. And when I was a young man and there was a lady who was older than me, and I'll say significantly older than me, more than just a year or two, but sometimes not that significantly older, because one of these ladies was my first grade teacher, and she was a very young woman. But I was first grade, so I guess that is significant. I called those ladies Miss last name, or Mrs. last name. That's what I called them. Even if I knew their first name, I would never call someone that had that significant age difference to me by their first name. And I don't, I'm not sure it's like that anymore. And I don't know. I want to say it was because of a degree of respect, but I don't think people today that don't do that aren't disrespecting somebody. They just have been taught something different than I have, or than I was when I was a boy. So Roger's mother, who was probably about the same age as my mother, maybe just a little older, so I'm going to say women my mother's age or older, I would have called them Mrs. whatever their name was. And it was a long, long time before that was not true with me. I would probably still do it. Even with women now that are younger than me, who I don't know that well, I would call them Mrs. whatever their name was, or Miss whatever their name is, because I don't feel like I'm entitled to just call them by their first name when I just met them. And that's just a part of how I was. But that began to change. One, as I got older, and I began to be the old person in the room. But it started changing before that. I was probably in my 30s, maybe middle to late 30s, when I started adjusting that policy. And this is how I got there, thinking about that. My sojourn went something like this. I was thinking about Mrs. Robinson. And then I began to think about what I just talked about, that thing that I had about calling women by their last name and putting Miss or Mrs. before it. And then I tried to think, when did that change? And probably one of the first places it changed, I met a lady at the church I go to. And when I met her, her name became to me Mrs. Allen. Her name actually her first name was Wilma. She was Wilma Allen. Her husband's name was, I believe his name was Ray. And I met them as Ray Allen and Wilma Allen. And so, but I always called her Mrs. Allen. And almost from the beginning, I would say Mrs. Allen, as we were having a discussion, and I would say Mrs. Allen, and she would say Wilma. And things would go on, and when I need to use her name again, I would say Mrs. Allen, and she would say Wilma. Because she wanted me to call her Wilma. But she met that criteria. She was a lady that's about the same age as my mother, maybe not quite as old as my mother, but she had a sister that was the same age as my mother. That's often the reason for our conversation. We would be discussing her sister. I'd ask about her. and because that's where I got most of my information from her. She was a lady that I'd known as a child. She lived down the block from us on 16th Street. I lived on 15th Street. They lived on the opposite corner of that block from us. They lived at 16th and E, and we lived almost at 15th and F. And she had two boys. One of them my age. His name was Tom. She actually had three boys, an older one named Don, who was enough older that I never did know him very well. But Tom was my age, and Jack was 2 years younger than me, or maybe one. He was closer to Kurt's age. And we were childhood friends and spent a lot of time with each other. And their mother's name was Mary Ellen. But to me, she was Mrs. Shortridge. She was always Mrs. Shortridge. I don't think I ever referred to her as Mary Ellen. But she was Wilma's sister, and so we would be having a discussion. It was like that too. Wilma would be calling her Mary Ellen. I'd be calling her Mrs. Shortridge. Wilma never insisted that I call her Mary Ellen. She allowed me to call her sister Mrs. Shortridge, but boy, Wilma, she didn't want me calling her Mrs. Allen. And finally one day she just abruptly stopped me and she said, "Luke, listen to me. I've tried to tell you this and you don't pay attention." She said, "I don't want you to call me Mrs. Allen. I want you to call me Wilma." Can you understand that? It's not I'm giving you permission to call me Wilma. I want you to call me Wilma, and I don't want you to call me Mrs. Allen. So I tried after that to call her Wilma. But sometimes Mrs. Allen slipped out. And we had a neighbor there in that same time when I was just a boy, and her name was Mary Ruth. And I knew her name was Mary Ruth because my mother's name was Mary Ruth. And they didn't, a lot of people called my mother Mary, but everybody called the neighbor lady Mary Ruth. They used both their names. Except the neighbor lady always called my mother Mary Ruth. And my mother called her Mary Ruth. So Mary Ruth called Mary Ruth Mary Ruth. But I never called Mrs. Lewis Mary Ruth. She was always Mrs. Lewis to me. She was the neighbor lady. It was the age of my mother, or thereabouts. And then another lady who caused me to make the transition, and this is about the same time as Wilma because I met this lady at the same place where I went to church. And when we first started going to church there, I was, early 30s, and these ladies were older than me. And the other lady's name was Dorothy Malott. And Dorothy and I became really good friends. She's passed on now, so's Wilma. In fact, all these ladies are gone now. But Dorothy, her maiden name was Spray, and I didn't know her when her name was Spray, but come to know this later. And she had a sister, and her sister's name was Mary. And her last name was Martin. I would have never called her Mary Martin. That's what Dorothy called her. Dorothy called her Mary. And to me, she was Mrs. Martin. And she was Mrs. Martin because when I was in the first grade, Mrs. Martin, I think I was the first class she ever had. She just got out of school. She was about 23 years old, 23 or 24, young lady. And she was my first grade teacher, Mrs. Martin. And she was Mrs. Martin from then on. To me, I would have never dared call her Mary, no matter what. But Dorothy referred to her as Mary, and I didn't refer to Dorothy as Mrs. Malott for very long. She wouldn't allow it. She said, "Look, it's Dorothy. Call me Dorothy." And everybody called her Dorothy, so she was one of these persons that was easy to feel like you were on a first name basis with, and she's just easy to love and easy to communicate with. And so she probably more than anybody helped me make that transition to begin to call ladies by their name and not feel like I was doing something disrespectful to them by doing that. And then one of the last ones, the last one I'm going to mention in this, that was the same way about this, and I had an awful time with calling her by her first name too. Her name was Charlene, and her last name was Williams. And she was another one of those really special ladies who I became friends with. And I first met her, I don't know whether, I think I first met her, she had a son my age, just a little bit older than me. He and I are good friends. But she was married to a man that I knew as well, and I knew their son first, but I didn't really know. I met him when we were both young men. I knew of him before I ever met him, because he played basketball at the boys club just a year or two ahead of me. So I knew who he was, but we went to different schools and we lived in different towns, and never really met him, never was really close to him until later. We were in our middle to late 20s probably. And I think I met his mother because of his father. I knew his father. I might have met his father because of him, but his father and I worked together. Actually, I was a supervisor, and his father had a job under my supervision, but I always like to refer to that as we worked together, not he worked for me. But he was another magnificent person, and a great worker, and just one of the kind of people that when you're a supervisor you love to have working with you. I knew him, and I met Charlene through him, and then I already knew her son, so I met her as being his mother, but still I met her not because she was his mother, but coincidentally that she was his mother. But I called her Mrs. Williams. I mean, what could you call her? You had to call her Mrs. Williams, so she didn't want me to call her Mrs. Williams. She wanted me to call her Charlene. And she was finally like Wilma. She said, Luke, how can I impress on you that I don't want you calling me Mrs. Williams, I want you to call me Charlene. Where we have a "you're Luke, I'm Charlene" relationship, and I know why you think you need to call me Mrs. Williams, but let me tell you, I want you to call me Charlene. And when you don't call me Charlene, it offends me more than when you do. So she helped me make that transition too. I don't know how long this took, but can you see that? Can you see what a sojourn is when your mind you start somewhere? And I started thinking about an auction, got to Roger Robinson's mother as I was thinking about that, and then went all these other places with all these other women before I could get back to thinking about an auction again. All that probably bored you to death, but it occurred to me. Couldn't get it off my mind. Finally just had to make a video. Maybe I'll just put this video in the archives and never publish it. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But I had to get it behind me because my mind kept going to it. Couldn't think about what I wanted to think about because it kept coming to how it related to this video. Till the next time, I'm a hard times guy. Have a good day.